celebrating 27th Foundation Day for the Center for Civil Society. And so we have an entire day planned for you, but we are going to begin with this discussion, what we call Baithak. And the idea is to facilitate discussion with experts on policy-related issues. And today, I'm so honored, glad, happy that we have two people who I really look forward to. First, I would introduce Gurcharan Ji, who is a renowned columnist, author, and most importantly, our guide, a board member at CCS. And he has done multiple things, but I won't get into details because we want to listen to the other gentlemen as much as we can with the limited time. He has hard stop at 11:30, so we'll respect that time. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, well, he has been the principal economic advisor to Ministry of Finance, and then now a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has done many things, but most important thing that I actually like is he's not like other economists who will present complex stuffs in a very jargon format. If you follow him on Twitter, you would find there are so many things that he talks about and the big follower he has. And recently, all the podcasts interviews he has given has actually helped people to get more followers, more views, and number of likes, etc., etc. So I'm also actually looking for, in days to come, I would love to have a longer, deeper conversation with Sanjeev, but this should actually work as a teaser when Gurcharan asks Sanjeev some key questions. So the plan for this 30-minute is, we'll open the floor and invite Sanjeev first to talk for 5 minutes about anything and everything that he thinks is important as on today. And then 15 minutes will be a dialogue between Gurcharan Das and Sanjeev Sanyal asking key questions. And then we'll keep 10 minutes for audience to ask questions. So that should be the format for the day. So I invite Sanjeev first to give the opening remarks. And the key thing he wishes to talk about is the process reforms. So Sanjeev, all yours.
Thank you very much. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here and to see many familiar faces in the audience. Now, we are meeting here at a very critical juncture in our economic history. So, in many ways, this is a real turning point. And this comes from a process of compounding. People forget that, you all learn compounding in school, but you forget how powerful it is. To give you a sense of this, let me tell you how it goes. So in 1991, when we began to reform our economy, we were only a $260 billion economy in nominal USD terms. It took us 16 years to become a $1 trillion economy. 16 years, okay? So it's only in 2007 that we became a $1 trillion economy. Then it took us 7 years to become a $2 trillion economy. So by 2014-15, we became a $2 trillion economy. Now, compounding should have meant that in 5 years, we should have become a $3 trillion economy, but we lost 2 years in COVID. So it's only in 21-22 that we became a $3 trillion economy. Now, it has just taken us 3 years, and this year, we will be close to a $4 trillion economy. The next trillion will come in little over 2 years. And the one after that, in about 18 months. So the reason I'm telling you about this process is that this allows us to kind of grow at rates that was simply not envisaged till very, very recently. Everybody thinks about, China is so far ahead of us and so on. Do remember that actually they only grew by 2.5 percentage points faster than us. They just compounded it over 30 years. That's how they become so much bigger than us. And now, for the first time, we are also growing 2.5 percentage points faster than us. This year, we will grow at 7%. And they'll go at 4.5. So this game really is about being able to sustain this over 25 years. Okay? This requires us to do 3 things. First, the obvious thing, we need to invest in India's supply side. Everybody loves demand-driven growth. I'm sorry, it doesn't sustain. You have to invest in the efficiency of the economy. This requires structural reforms, but also what I want to discuss today, process reforms. It requires heavy investment in infrastructure. It requires a private sector that is willing to go out there, take risks, invest in R&D and other such things. So basically getting the supply side up and running. And do remember, 7% GDP growth after having done several years of high growth is not a given thing. It has to be earned at every step. And very important thing that you need to remember is that this has to be done at a time when the rest of the world is not going to help us. So those who suddenly get excited, oh, why aren't we doing double-digit growth? Well, if you attempted to do double-digit growth at this juncture, you would end up importing far more than you could possibly export, because the rest of the world doesn't want your exports. It's in recession. I mean, Germany's growth this year is going to be 0.2, Japan 0.1. So you get the picture. So in that environment, we have to mostly rely on our own dynamics, and that our judgment is 7% is pretty good under those circumstances. Will still make us by some margin the fastest growing economy in the world, but good times will also come some point in the next decade, at some point, and that point in time we can take the chance and press the accelerator. But you have to drive the car according to the quality of the highway, not according to what some mental plan you have about the world. Number one. Number two, and it's a related point, which is that macroeconomic stability matters. Okay? This is not likely to get you lots of points in the short run. But the fact is, we now have anchored inflation for 10 odd years in the 2 to 6% range. No trivial achievement, given that we used to be a 8 to 12% inflation country. We have cleaned up our banks. We now have foreign exchange reserves worth about 670 billion, which interestingly is more than our external debt. So we are a small net lender to the world. I'm telling you all of this is because you see, it is very easy to push for short-term growth and lose track of this bit. And then what happens, you get few years of growth and it all comes unraveled. It's happened to emerging market after emerging market. It's very often given the cool term middle income trap, but basically this is what happens. Whether it's the Latin Americans in the 50s and 60s or Southeast Asia in the 90s, they did get a phase of very high growth. Those of you who remember the 90s will remember they were called the tiger economies. And then suddenly their financial system all went belly up. They had a crisis and they never quite got back on the rails. This is something that can quite easily happen to us as well. As somebody who has spent several years cleaning up the banks, let me tell you, I have no intention of going through this again. We are very paranoid about froth in the financial system. Sometimes it means that we have to introduce things that may make us somewhat unpopular, like short-term capital gains tax, long-term capital gains tax, to try and calm things down. I think people are a little less annoyed with us after the Japan incident last week, but I think you get the picture. So the second point is macroeconomic stability matters. 3, some part of society will need support, the bottom 20%. It requires direct support of various kinds. We have done it using various transfers, as you may have seen, or it may mean that you have to invest into the Prime Minister's Awas Yojana and many other schemes that we have done, because this group is otherwise simply not going to benefit from this growth. But this is very, very different concept, the concept of Antyodaya. Antyodaya means the rise of the bottom. But it's a very different concept of dealing with poverty than the Western debate about inequality. Antyodaya is about targeting absolute poverty. This is not about getting into debates about how many billionaires India has. I have made this point many, many times that we are 1/6 of the world's population. We deserve to have 1/6 of the world's billionaires here. We need more first generation billionaires. We should encourage this process. Piketty and Oxfam are not going to create the jobs. I'm sorry. And in fact, the fun part about all these left-wing groups that love to scream about inequality of India is that almost all of them are sponsored by Gates Foundation, Soros's Open Society, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Omidyar Foundation. Now, who on earth was Ford and Rockefeller and Soros and Gates and Omidyar? They're all billionaires. So the problem really is with Indian billionaires. Gora billionaire to theek hai. So the debate on inequality in India should not get into this business of billionaires or not. We in fact need more billionaires. The real debate in India should be about absolute poverty and whether or not we are doing a good job of removing that, and we can debate that. I am all in favor of that debate. So those are the three principles. And let me end by saying we have a genuine opportunity of growing rapidly over the next generation, demographics and many other reasons falling in our way. But even in the relatively short time horizon, let me say in the next 36 months or so, we will first go past Japan and then Germany to become the world's third largest economy. Now, of course, nothing is certain in the world, so we have to still put in the effort. But this will be a major event in the world economy, not just in Indian economy. And I think we should make every effort to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjeev. 5 minutes of highly packed, intense insights. Gurcharan.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I'm glad you talked about the fact that the debate on inequality is the wrong debate, that what we need is also, you countered it with the idea of protecting the extremely poor. That too is true. But the real question actually is opportunity. I wish that instead of inequality, there would be some index worldwide of measuring opportunity. Because the only dignified way that you lift the poor into the middle class is through jobs. And so it's really the code word for jobs. And I was very happy to see that in this government and this budget particularly, because frankly it was very disappointing during the election campaign that nobody talked about jobs. And in fact, anyway, your time is limited, so let me just jump in and tell the people here that the most exciting thing I think that you are doing today goes by a very boring word called process reform. And really, actually, since we are very close to our own country's Azadi, not only celebrating 27 years of CCS's fight for Azadi in our country, that this idea of, to me, the process reforms actually is true Azadi. And so let me quickly ask Sanjeev to talk about what he has been doing and something which I find very, very inspiring.
If we are going to take this approach of generating jobs, generating growth, this also has to be about creative destruction. And I think this is the truly interesting debate to be had in India, if you want to have a debate about opportunity and growth, etc. So here, let me give you some data points which you can verify on your own. So if you go and look at the top 10 companies in the US from 20 years ago and compare them to today, you will find that 9 out of 10 are new companies. Only Microsoft is in the top 10, which is the same company. All the others, even if they've existed before, they have entered the top 10 in relatively recent times, but some of them are not very old companies. Amazon, Alphabet, Tesla, and so on and so forth. Meta. So Many of these companies have really come up 25 years ago, 20 years ago, and so on. Nvidia is an old company, but I had never heard of it till 2 years ago. Now, same thing you do with China. Other than a couple of very old banks, state-owned banks, 8 out of 10 companies with the largest market cap are new companies. Okay, many of them were set up really recently. BYD is now one of the world's largest automobile companies, not just EV company, automobile companies across the spectrum. And BYD was only set up 14 years ago. China's largest software company is only 9 years old. Okay. Now, look at the Indian list. First of all, 7 out of 10 are exactly the same company. It's the same Reliance, the same whatever company. And even the 3 companies that are new in that list are actually old companies like LIC that happen to get listed. So one of the things that is quite stunning about India, I think, and the real discussion that should be had, is about the stickiness and the lack of creative destruction that happens in India. And this, in my view at least, is linked to the fact that the entry of new blood, new talent, etc., into the Indian economic sphere is very, very slow. It just doesn't encourage new companies to scale up and become bigger and so on and so forth. And this brings me to the reason why this is the case. And one of them is that the frictional costs for getting from being small to really big are so high. And a lot of it is bureaucratic inertia, rules, regulations, that once you have become very, very big and you have somehow managed to get yourself all the permits and gone around everybody, paid whoever needs to be paid, whatever needs to be done to get big, it is simply impossible for you for a newcomer to simply rebuild and recreate that in order to replace an incumbent. Now, that is the context in which I'm just bringing the issue of process reforms in from this angle, just because I said CCS is a good place to talk about it in creative destruction terms. So what are process reforms? Process reforms, as opposed to structural reforms, which structural reforms, by the way, are all the big reforms. Everybody likes changing the structure of something, whether it's the insolvency and bankruptcy code or the GST system replacing all the old indirect taxes, those are structural reforms. Process reforms are about all the boring reforms, the nuts and bolts, changing rule number 73, subsection D. But a lot of reform is about this kind of reform. And let me tell you, it has amazing impact, sometimes very large impact. Just because the reform is small does not mean the impact is small. And this is absolutely critical in order to remove the frictions, in order to allow this creative destruction process, which brings new talent and so on. And of course, it smoothens out the opportunity part that you mentioned as well.
So let's specifically talk about some specific process reforms that you have done, and that you are working on.
So, till about 7 years ago, you'll be shocked to hear a country our size used to only do 9,900 patents a year, not even 10,000 patents a year, 9,900 patents a year. This is in the context where the US does over 3 lakh patents a year. And China, at that time, used to do about 4 lakh. Now it does about 7 lakh patents a year. Admittedly, much of that is low quality utility patents. But if you strip all of that away, about 2 to 3 lakhs, somewhere in that range, is the number of good patents they do. So we were trying to play the game of knowledge economy and so on with less than 10,000 patents. Now, that was slowly rising over time till a little over 2 years ago. I discovered this issue and then did a full study of the process of why this was, the lack of people, the ridiculous number of years and processes you needed to move this. Just come across.
Yeah.
Come across here.
Yeah.
Come here. So, what used to happen as a result of all of that is that in India, it used to take 5, 6, 7 years to get a patent. Now imagine you're in a technology environment and it's taking you these many years to get a patent. The game has already changed by the time your patent actually turns up, if it turns up. And it had years of backlogs as well. So we have cleaned that up, and a result of which, in the financial year just ended in March, we did 103,000 patents, the 103,000 patents. That suddenly brought us into the same order of magnitude. We are still far away from what China and the US are doing, but it's a 10-time increase in 6 years, or and in the 3 times increase in 2 years. So the point I'm making to you is simply changing basic processes has a dramatic impact. And some of you, if you've tried to get yourself a patent in the last couple of years, you will suddenly find that those patents are turning up in, well before of time.
And the reason why the patents were taking so long is partly not enough people there, but also partly the process.
Absolutely, both of them. And I'll give you one example. We used to allow anybody to raise an objection at any point in the entire process. So now imagine you have gone through 5 years, you've killed yourself, finally it's going to come, then your competitor suddenly puts an objection. And it starts from, it's like snakes and ladders, right? Yeah. And of course, the patent office officials loved all of this because, many people were paid off as a result of all of this. So this is how it used to go. So now it's been cleaned up. It's a lot better. I'm not saying it's perfect. We now need to look at trademarks and other things where similar problems also emerge. I'll give you another example like this. I don't know if any of you have ever attempted to shut down a company in India voluntarily. I'm not talking about bankruptcy. 90% of shutdowns of companies are done purely as a part of, natural, some guy decides he's become too old to keep running the business, or that technology has become too old, whatever the reason, subsidiary of big company needs to be shut down, whatever the reason. For entirely voluntary reasons, every year, large numbers of companies are shut down. Now, anybody who has attempted to do this will know it used to take many, many years, even when there was no court case, there was no tax outstanding, nobody actually minded it being shut down, but you couldn't. And so the poor owner had to keep doing company, quarterly meetings, file all kinds of things, even though this company actually should be just shut down. And nobody's objecting. So again, I looked into this. This was when I was in finance ministry. And I looked at the process. So it turns out you had to get all these NOCs from tax, labor, etc., etc. And for some reason, you had to get them in a certain sequence. Okay. Then once you'd got all of them, you went to the ROC, that's the registrar of companies, and then they had to put up an advertisement saying that you are shutting down the company, because you have to intimate the world that you're shutting it down in case there is anyone who wants to raise an objection. And that process used to take up to a year, if not more. In fact, the likelihood was that you had to pay off somebody in the ROC to get your name into the list that was put up as the ad. So just imagine a completely pointless part of the process. You had to pay somebody to just put an ad up, which is a standard procedure. So I went through this, again made a presentation, etc. to the political leadership. And what we did is, first of all, a website has been created called CPAN. And in that, what happens is that you load which company you want to number, etc. And now it simultaneously sends it to all the parties that require. So it's instead of parallel process, you have got, you've got a parallel process instead of a sequential process. Second, if nobody actively raises an objection, after a period of 3 weeks or something, then the system itself generates NOCs. And when all the NOCs have been achieved, it then creates a list and sends it to the ROC to publish it in the newspaper. Now, you have created a process where you actively need to do something in order to stop the process, as opposed to the other way, we had to actively do something to keep it going. So you can imagine suddenly it's become smoother. So what used to take years is now taking 90 days.
I would really like you to tell the Google Map story. That will be very relatable for our audience. How this was technically still illegal.
Yes.
While everyone was using it.
Yes, so as many of you may not realize that till about 2021, Google Maps was actually technically illegal in India. And this is despite the fact that Google Maps is actually an Indian product. It was developed in the Chennai and Hyderabad offices of Google by, a bunch of Indian geeks who were there. And the reason for this is that cartography in India was actually a monopoly of an institution called the Survey of India, which is there in Dehradun. And this monopoly had existed from British times for obvious reasons, because the British colonial power obviously wanted to ensure that nobody else other themselves had access to good maps. In fact, it was not. It was traditionally, in fact, run largely by military officials. So every map that you saw had to be certified. Now it's obviously one. It meant that the cartography sector didn't grow, but it also ironically meant that anything that is as fluid, like say Google Map, which you cannot keep going back to Survey of India to certify, that happened. That happened to be therefore illegal. It's a different matter that everybody downloaded it. So I of course called some people from those who were regulators of this universe for a meeting, and I sent them a invitation on Google Maps. So they all turned up for the meeting, and I asked them that they had any difficulty finding the place. They said no, they had all used Google Maps. So I told them that I showed them on their own law that it was illegal. And I started then a conversation, and then a few months later, it got opened up, and now the geospatial sector is open, as you know. I use similar arguments to open up drones and space and many other sectors. So, point I'm making to you is that, you have got to be at it.
And what I would urge you to do next, a small thing, but there are lots of people who acquired shares at one time, or their parents acquired shares. And these poor people, it takes them years to get them, to get access to those shares. And just somebody who is a Dalit family, and they somehow they got their father got Reliance shares for some very good work that he had done. And anyway, the father died and all the process. And now it's been 5 years that they've been fighting. And there's an organization, all these shares land up in an office in Delhi. And I can't exactly remember what, they all have the same kind of opaque letters, EEPO or EPFO or something like that. And basically it's the consumer, they become part of the public domain. Anyway, it's a nightmare.
No, I agree with you. And if anybody here wants to work on just this issue, please raise your hand, and I will be very happy to take you on. Be aware that you will work very hard. You will make lots of government officials dislike you intensely. But it has to be done. It has to be done. So I'm always looking for a volunteer to work on issues like this inheritance laws, that entire area, but especially if somebody with a legal background, that would be wonderful.
Perfect.
So
well, I can see already some smiling faces.
And be aware that you are not going to be popular with the system afterwards. But you will develop a certain liking for the taste of blood.
And this is really, apart from the taste of blood, what we'll be doing is true freedom for the Indian people.
No, I'll tell you one which is a parallel thing that I'm actually working on. Since those were the legacy ones that have succeeded, let me tell you the ones I'm actually working on right now. Just day before yesterday, I published an article on this about EPFO. Yeah. So EPFO is, as you know, Employee Provident Fund. This is mostly for relatively entry-level jobs or up to 15,000. It's mandatory. There are people above that also who go in. where some part is contributed by deduction from the salary, some part is provided by the employer, and then 1% is given by the government. So some amount of it goes into this EPF. Now, any of you have had the misfortune of actually dealing with it will know that the money goes into this dark hole from which it is not very easy to extract it. Now, we've known this for decades, but there was no data about how particularly bad it was. So thankfully, in 2017, they finally began digitizing and combining this data. And so in the subsequent few years, we have discovered that something like 28% of claims fail. 28%. But for pensioners, 44% of them claims fail. Okay. And ultimately what happens, as with such things in India, I don't have statistics on it, but I went through to figure out how this worked. Effectively, it goes to some sort of a broker type person who then charges you a part of your money and miraculously knows how to run the website. And there are, let's say, strong rumors that some part of that money is shared with mid to lower level officials of EPFO. So this is what goes on. Not surprising, it happens in many aspects of Indian life. But finally, that we have this data, we are trying to do something about it. Not surprisingly, there are many people who are deeply offended by any attempt to improve the system. So I get sort of letters from various segments of the system telling me that it is not so bad, and etc., etc. But my own view on this is you have to persist.
Yeah, and I would say that really I'm so glad, because CCS is dedicated precisely to this kind of freedom for our citizens. And it's a good time just before Independence Day for us to be talking about it. And what could be more useful for CCS and our interns, our members of our teams here? What could be more important than bringing this kind of freedom to, and how, 5 years from now, hopefully you'll still be around 5 years from now over there, but what could be more useful? So Sanjeev, actually we should be offering you the kind of help, support by people who are truly motivated to work in what the government calls missionary mode. Mission mode. Yes, I'm sorry. Mission mode.
The other word may have all kinds of other
Yes. But I can only tell you one story about missionaries. When they first came in the 19th century during the British Raj to Bengal, the British Raj was not very encouraging of missionaries, but there was an evangelical movement in the Victorian period, and so they landed up, and basically the base of the British Raj was Bengal and Bihar, and so these guys went out into the rural areas, and the peasants of Bengal and Bihar welcomed these missionaries, and the missionaries were surprised. They were being welcomed, and they said, "No problem. We'll make Jesus Christ one of our gods. And why? Would you like him to be an avatar of Vishnu or Shiva?" He gave them the choice also. And those guys were so shocked, they just ran away. And this partly accounts for the fact why Christianity is, less than 2% of India's population became Christian, unlike many, many colonial countries.
Well, that is a good story. The reality of it is much more brutal. First of all, missionaries came to India with the Portuguese, not with the British.
Yes, but
and they carried out several massacres, including the Goa Inquisition, in which tens of thousands of people were massacred. So I don't think it's an issue we should trivialize.
Yeah, but I'm not trivializing. I'm making a comment about the British Raj versus the Portuguese Raj. There's a very different reason. Portugal did not control India for 150 years. It was the British. And that is why it's less than 2%. In Portuguese territories, it's 25 to 30%. Yeah, right.
Now I know Sanjeev has to
He has to go.
go, and there are but people who have gathered to actually ask question and interact. So we open the floor, but at the same time, Sanjeev, I want you to tell this story of missing national monument at Kashmiri Gate. That I think is a very interesting story that audience must know.
Right.
Okay, so there used to be, or there is, a long list of national monuments that India considers monuments of national importance, and these are then protected under something called the AMSAR Act. And if you go to a national monument, you'll see this blue-colored board which threatens you with all kinds of dire consequences if you did anything to the monument. So that's from the AMSAR Act. So there are 3,700 odd of these monuments. So how did they end up in that list? So it turns out most of them are inherited from the British period list, with a few additions of princely states and other things along the way. And this list has never really been edited and rationalized since colonial times. Now, net result of that is that the list is full of monuments that are completely missing, or monuments that simply do not warrant being in the national list. And by the way, the fact that they are missing monuments is not new. We have known for decades that some of these monuments are unknown, nobody knows where they are. So just a few months ago, a list finally came out of, So last year, by the way, I had written a report on this whole issue, and a few months ago, the 18 missing monuments have been notified, and we will try and delist them. But the more difficult one is to delist ones that shouldn't be in the list at all, because they are unworthy. And many of these are graves and other things of British officials. So just to give you an example, in Nagaland, they have only 4 nationally protected monuments. 3 of them are graves of obscure British officials who had been killed by the Nagas. Okay, and they're nothing great. They have, small graves the size of half of this room. So nothing of architectural importance also. Now, if you think that these kinds of monuments exist in faraway places, let me tell you about the one that exists in Delhi. So, there was in the revolt of 1857-58, during the retaking by the British of the city, there was a massive massacre, and it was carried out by somebody called John Nichols. You can read up about him. John Nichols was considered to be an absolutely brutal fellow, even by the standards of his time. So after, the rebellion was put down and a few decades went by, a grateful colonial government put up a statue to him in front of Kashmiri Gate and designated it as a national monument. And his body, when he died, by the way, he died very shortly after the sacking of Delhi from injuries from the battle. And he was also just outside Kashmiri Gate, in fact, across from the Kashmiri Gate station, he was buried. Now, the British turned both the grave and the statue into a national monument. Now, independent India inherited that list without editing. So they became national monument in India. Okay? Independent India. Now, somewhere in the 1950s, the Northern Irish, from where Nicholson came from, requested for his statue so that they could put up in his village or whatever where he came from. So the Indian government very thoughtfully sent the statue, which was then put up in somewhere in Northern Ireland, where it is regularly worshipped or whatever it is they do to it. But the interesting point is they did not delist the statue. So, till today, the spot on which that statue used to stand is still a nationally protected monument at Kashmiri Gate. And of course, his grave, which is across the few 700 meters away, is also a nationally protected monument. You can go and see it if you come out of Kashmiri Gate station. You can cross the road. There is a Nicholson cemetery. You can go inside it. It is nicely. That's the only grave because he was considered, I suppose there's a lot of other British graves there, but perhaps they were not brutal enough. So this one is the one that is protected with a nice fence around it, and of course there is the blue board, which we are warned that if we did anything to it, grave consequences will be put on us. So again, as a part of the report I did last year, I had put up these things. So the good news is, just last week, the Archaeological Survey of India has issued a notification saying that at least the empty spot of the statue is not going to be any longer a nationally protected monument. Now, let me tell you why this is more than just getting rid of, some decolonization and cleanup. You see, all kinds of things come up when you become a national monument, because remember, the rules are made for Taj Mahal. So therefore, money is spent, 100 plus 200 meter radius, it becomes protected area. Now imagine this is happening in Kashmiri Gate area, highly crowded. So a radius of 300 meters, you can imagine what happens. And of course, not surprisingly, again, there's a great deal of rent seeking and other things that happen as a result of which is of course the explanation of why a missing, completely, it's not even missing, we know where it is, it's in Northern Ireland, and nobody in Northern Ireland is doing a 300 meter radius protection of that building. But here we are. So this whole thing needs, everything needs cleaning up. And at every single step, you will discover it will make you unpopular when you try to do this, because obviously there is a vested interest who wants to continue this thing. So somebody has to stand up and do this. For whatever reason, I have chosen to be that guy, which of course means that either in the bureaucracy or in the judiciary, I'm not the most popular person. Some of you may know I have made some comment about the fact that the higher judiciary shouldn't be taking long vacations. Now, it's a common sense point I made. I don't think, why do the whole courts have to be shut? Why can't they just take vacation like everybody else? If a judge needs a vacation, he writes an application, takes a vacation, goes to England or wherever he goes, reads his Victorian novels and comes back. That's perfectly fine with me. I don't see why the whole judicial system has to be shut down for several weeks, if not months, a year. Now, it's a common sense point. Clearly, it was shocking enough that many judges of the Supreme Court deemed it necessary to comment on my comment. And the Tamil Nadu Bar Council even issued a fatwa against me. You can read it up. But this is something...
Did you get a contempt notice?
Not yet, but I'll wait for it. But the point of the matter is that this is an absurd situation where simple, common sense truth telling is resisted by the system. And I think the time has come when we, the citizens of India, have to stand up and demand some level of accountability from the institutions of the state.
I'm just concerned about your...
Yes, I now have to indeed head off.
Sorry we didn't get a chance to... I know there's some hands raised and there are 2, 3, 4, 5...
2 questions. I'll have to really run away after this. So 2 questions.
Okay.
One from this gentleman here and one from the back.
After Rajendra Nagar incident, everything's kind of supported you, that kids are in very bad situations, they are struggling, the success rate is low. So what is the alternative? Second, can we introduce Agniveer, like after 8 years they will be evaluated, because that's an invincibility of civil servants, that they can't be removed.
No, so I am very sympathetic to the idea of some sort of Agniveer type thing, although it hasn't, I think needs to be thought through carefully. But my point is, I was making an even simpler point, which is that it makes no sense that these coaching classes are selling a product which has a failure rate of 99.92%. Yeah, that makes no sense. No other product in the world would sell if they told you 99.92% failure rate and we are now going to charge you lakhs of rupees and 5 years of your life to crack this exam. It makes absolute no sense. Now, there are many reasons for it, and one can talk about the fact that maybe one part of it is the excessive charm of maybe the bureaucracy, etc. But one significant part of it is to do with a certain social culture, where we are the only society in the world which celebrates joining the bureaucracy. No Other successful society celebrates joining the bureaucracy. They celebrate their artists, they celebrate their athletes, they celebrate their entrepreneurs, they celebrate their scientists.
Can I interrupt one
Yes.
second? Sanjeev, since I've spent a lot of time in Bombay,
Yes.
and I've spent time in Delhi, and I can tell you the culture of Bombay is very different. That,
Bangalore.
yeah, in other words, in Bombay, we have contempt for the bureaucracy and bureaucratic jobs. And one of the reasons is that we have created, the private sector has created enough jobs, and there is no only one CEO as there is in Delhi. There are 1 lakh CEOs in Bombay and Bangalore. And so you have many ways to rise up in the world. And so one of the, this goes back to my point about jobs, that it's partly a failure of our model, our economic model that we have followed, where we have still not created an industrial revolution, and we have been firing on 2 out of 3 cylinders, and we haven't fired on manufacturing and industry.
This is a circular problem, because one of the reasons that we are not generating those kinds of jobs in places like Bihar, for example, is because the bureaucracy is one of the major impediments to this. And by the way, it's not only the top UPSC, the whole architecture of bureaucracy, going down to all the health inspectors and the building inspector and the traffic police inspector.
I'm worried about your time. Shall we get the second question?
Yeah, okay, why not?
Your government has done some commendable work in ease of doing business. What about ease of doing charity, and when will we see process reforms in FCRA?
So here, so there are 2 parts to this. Ease of doing charity, I think there are many needs to simplify, for example, Societies Act and so on, including ease of exit. But on the specific case of FCRA, I think we do need to be very, very careful about this issue, because this is not a case of free market. A lot of this money, I'm sorry to say, is unfortunately used by foreign groups of various kinds or even corporates to manipulate societies. And we have just seen in Bangladesh a very good example of what happens if you do not control these external forces. And it's not Bangladesh is happening next door, so you're watching it. You can go and Google up what is happening also in Kenya, for example. So you need to be very, very careful about allowing unfettered flow of money in the charity area, because you see, unlike in the commercial space, and even there sometimes you need to control things, but in the commercial space, for whatever it's worth, the whip of market forces and other transparency requirements means that there is some level of accountability. Sometimes may go wrong, but there is some level of accountability. In the charity space, because supposedly charity, anything goes. So, since there is no objective way of evaluating performance, it is a very easy conduit for manipulative forces to take advantage of it. Now, it does, I agree, mean that once you put sand in the wheels, it affects even good causes. I'm not denying that at all, but do understand that it is not this control over FCRA is not as random as many people make it out to be. Most money coming from foreign groups into India under the FCRA route are used for extremely suspicious causes. That's how it is. And it's not easy ex ante to tell, because many of the same groups that are doing manipulation of our politics, manipulation of our society, are also simultaneously sometimes doing genuinely good work. As a cover maybe, but they're also doing that. So we need to be very, very careful about this.
Sanjeev, I have one question.
Yes, it'll have to be the last one.
It'll be quite short. I mean, you're working at the central level, on central level, laws, processes or whatever. A lot of the problems happen in the states. Is there some kind of this thing, any initiative happening to bring the states on board?
I'm a creature of the central government, so I can't speak for the states. But there are many, many areas where there are things that the center does, even in state subjects or concurrent lists, where we can play a nudging role towards this whole thing. And I'll give you one example of it to end the story. Now, do you wonder why Indian cities, since independence, at least since the 60s, are all look uniformly ugly? Yeah, it is not to do because we don't know architecture. After all, if you look at cities built before independence, whether it's built Indian old traditional, Jaipur type cities, or even the ones that the British built, they're all quite good looking. Yeah, we are still functioning on many of our iconic buildings of most of our Indian cities come up pre-independence buildings, or sometimes pre-British buildings also. So why is it that we have built so few iconic buildings after independence? Now, ironically, it is because we imposed on ourselves a national building code, which is full of ridiculous rules. Now, building codes were then nationally given out, and then they were replicated at the state levels as well, which encoded an ugly RCC PWD architecture that we have now ended up replicating across the country. Now, I have written also about this, again, having annoyed a lot of people about it. But the fact of the matter is, if we attempted to build the Taj Mahal today, you couldn't actually do it, even if you wanted to, because the laws don't allow you to do it. There'll be some rule 73B, subsection C, that will not allow you to do this. And you should read the rules, how ridiculous they are. Some of them will tell you the size, they will tell you the exact size of your prayer room. Now, why on earth? How do you care what your prayer room should be? How many staircases should go up and down? If you build, supposing in this building you decide to build an extra staircase, you're actually not allowed to do this and you can be fined for doing it. Now, why? I understand that building laws are there for purposes of safety. Fair enough. Integrity of the construction, etc. Why do they have to interfere with my internal spaces? Why do we need, for example, this bizarre form of architecture where we have to leave huge amount of space, setbacks and all that? You go around the world to Paris or New York, there are no setbacks and so on. So what is happening? A lot of this space is being wasted and we are expanding out our cities unnecessarily. The laws, for example, don't allow, if you build a factory in India, almost 50% of the footprint of your land cannot actually be used for the factory. So imagine the amount of enormous wastage. It makes it expensive, the wastage of land. We are expanding our cities much, much more than is necessary. Because you are expanding it so fast, you cannot make, the utilities like public transport cannot function. It is ridiculous.
So this really points to the importance of this unsexy word called process.
Absolutely.
And really, I can't imagine a more useful. The reality is that India's image in the world is diminished every day as a result of being a very difficult country to work in. And what you're pointing out is why.
Absolutely.
Why is it that we have such a poor image of being an over-regulated and under-governed society?
Over-regulation and under-governed are actually the same thing. Because the CCS, you'll understand complexity theory. One of the points about complex systems is, the more complex the system becomes, the fewer rules it follows. An infinitely complex system will only follow one rule. Now, this has an interesting implication. I'm going to literally end with this. Is that, you see, when you have a complex systems thinking of the world, it means that there are lots of things like unintended consequences and things like that. So therefore, the best way to deal with a increasingly complex system is to have simpler and simpler rules. Now, the conventional thinking is that India is a more complicated country than Singapore. Therefore, we should have more complicated tax laws than Singapore. Complex systems thinking actually leads you to the exact opposite conclusion. India is a more complicated country than Singapore, therefore we can impose far fewer rules on it. Therefore, the rules should be even simpler than Singapore.